Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to talk a bit about Storm Desmond for about a minute, and then really about the impact this had on the loss of electricity and how that had knock-on effects to so many other systems. The substation was next to the river. This is historic because that's where the power station was in 1915 during an armaments manufacture in a previous war. But the trouble was that it flooded. It's the first time for about 50, 60 years. Supplies were lost to more than 100,000 people, and they weren't fully restored for about 4 days. This had some pretty devastating effects on the community. I'm not talking about the scale of effect that we've seen in the last month in Venezuela, but that was a very different situation. That was a country that was already in turmoil with people leaving just because of food shortages. Here we were, a nice, quiet town, city, not very dissimilar to many places that one has in Norway, and all of a sudden we were struck without the electricity, and this was a major impact on society. So I organised a conference a couple of months later at the university where we looked at all the implications, and we invited people from the local supermarket, from the hospitals, from the care homes, from the homeless shelters, from any number of different infrastructure providers to come and meet us and talk about their experiences. And what I'm going to be discussing today are those experiences. Now, we lost supply basically because of electricity, but that wasn't the only reason that we could lose supplies, and it would be very different causes, but very much the same effects from any number of other sources. So this is primarily about loss of electricity. It's not about storms. If you spend a couple of minutes on the internet looking at loss of electricity, cybersecurity is one of the big issues that comes up. Now, I'm not a cybersecurity expert, but I have noticed that this is the prime reason that people are worrying about loss of electricity. There's one very important point about our experience in Lancaster, and that was that we were basically a relatively small geographic area. I've marked it on this map in red. We were hit 50 kilometres away, no problems. Anyone with a bicycle could go cycle 50 kilometres and find a restaurant that was open, had decent food and everything else. So we were not completely isolated, but life was still very different. And it's worth saying that it could have been a lot worse. That in many ways we were lucky, and I'll explain that in due course. Now, one of the first things that was fairly obvious was that we lost the internet, generally after about 10 seconds. It shouldn't have been a surprise. If you look round the side of that big green box, you'll find something that says danger, 230 volts, which does tend to give the hint that if you lose the power supply, you've probably lost the contents of it. So that was a problem. We also lost phones. People who had traditional phones without too much electronics in them and no power supply were fine. Those who had wireless phones, or those that had PABX systems like doctors' surgeries, dentists, lawyers' offices, they all failed. And this was significant because it did mean that even with the landline system, we lost communications with so many different organisations. Some mobile phones lasted a whole 20 minutes. Others went out almost immediately. It wasn't just that our batteries went flat, it was that basically the base stations went wrong. We lost radio and TV. Lancaster is surrounded by hills of one sort and another, so we have our own booster station for TV and also for the digital radio, and we lost all that. We could still pick up FM transmissions from 60, 100 kilometres away, but they didn't actually tell us what was going on in Lancaster, partly because when the BBC sends a reporter to Syria, they send them with a satellite phone and a big battery. When they send a reporter to Lancaster, they say, take your mobile phone and you can phone us just on the normal phone. And of course that wasn't working, and so of course the BBC didn't know what was going on, so all they said was, there's some floods somewhere up north, but we're not quite sure where or what's happened. There was one small low-powered transmitting station, almost a throwback to the 1960s in style of a little local station that had a few turntables, it played its records, it did all the sort of things that local stations did. It lost most of its input. It had to actually move because the studio itself was flooded. And people would come in off the street and say, hey, I've just been talking to a man in an orange jacket, and he says there's been a fire at such and such, which they then repeated quite happily over the radio. So there was news, but it wasn't anything like the official version of news. And it was, in fact, quite different from what I think many of the people who were trying to organise life at that time would have wanted. The effects of a loss of electricity were quite different depending on different groups of people. For those fairly well off, with a log burner, a garage full of their camping equipment, their outdoor activity equipment, probably a propane cooker in their garage, a gas-fired cooker in their kitchen, life was okay. Open a few bottles of wine, invite the neighbours round. Why not? What's not to like about it? For those living in flats, life was really very different. No heat, because gas is banned in flats in Britain after a rather nasty explosion about 40 years ago. So no heat, no cooking, no lights, no extractor fans, no water, including for toilet flushing, no lifts, no entry phone. So even if people came to see you, they couldn't push a button and say, hey, I'm here, and you couldn't let them in. And for people who have limited mobility, or large families, or any families for that matter, and were high up in tower blocks, life was very difficult. Now, luckily, Lancaster is a relatively small town with relatively few tower blocks, so the social dislocation of this was not great, but it could have been very much worse. Luckily, quite a number of systems continued to work as normal. So Mains water was generally good. If you look at the map, you can see on the bottom right there, a couple of nice big reservoirs 100 metres above the city, so supply of water was fine. We weren't pumping it from anywhere. The sewage network didn't flood. They had their own backup generators. Gas supplies were generally available because the pumping stations, the pressure reducing stations, were all outside the affected area. Had we lost also mains water, sewage and gas supplies, life would have been very, very different. And bear in mind, this was actually in December when there was a storm that had just deposited something like 300 millimetres of rain over the entire region. So it wasn't exactly the time you say, oh, not to worry, I'll just go and sit in the garden. The hospital was fine. Hospital was, if anything, over-provided with generators. It had backup generators and backup generators. So absolutely no problems. But they couldn't contact patients to say, please come in or please don't come in. And a lot of the other services around the city were not working. So doctors' surgeries were not working, emergency drop-in centres were not working, and so far more people came into the hospital, which flooded it. The hospital has a canteen designed primarily for staff and for people visiting patients. But people knew this, there was no limitation on it, so everybody came to the hospital and basically ate all their food, so the doctors had nothing much left after the first day. And one doctor told me that they had to turf students out of the hospital because students had turned up, their mobile phones not working, saying it's a flat battery. So they turned up with a big long connector strip, plugged it into the wall socket that they found somewhere in the hospital, and all plugged in their battery chargers. Didn't actually make anything better because there was no base station. But you can see how, because it was a focus of heat, light, something happening, that's where everybody came. And this is actually quite important because At the moment, in British society, certainly, there isn't a central focus where you would go to. In medieval times, in Lancaster, we've had a castle there since 1100 or something to repel Scots and other invaders. And that was originally the place you would go to if there was a problem. That's where you went. During Victorian times, it was the town hall, the city hall, which was the big place where everything was administered. They administered the tramways, they administered water. When the electricity came, they administered electricity. We had the corporation gas works. We had everything all based on the town hall. Now with privatisation, with best value contracting and so on, all these are placed outside. And so there are a lot of organisations that no longer have a combining force, and there's no obvious place to go when you say everything's gone. Who can tell me what to do? Who can tell me what's going to happen? Where can I find anything out? There isn't that central focus that we used to have. One of the organisations that was probably worst affected by the whole situation was a care home. This is a home with around 60 or 70 elderly people, many of them having to be helped out of bed by mechanical means, some of them seriously confused, many of them quite ill. They didn't have a backup generator, so they had all these people with no heat, no light, very difficult to wash or to be able to use the toilet because it was all in a completely dark area. The alarm buttons they had in their rooms, the pull strings didn't work. Anything they had around their neck didn't work. Nothing worked. There was no food. There was a cooker. It was a gas cooker. It was designed to operate. No problem at all. Problem was that it was had, for health and safety reasons, it was interlocked with an extractor fan. And if the extractor fan wasn't running, you couldn't actually use the gas cooker, so no heat. The chef made a barbecue in the garden. Remember, it's still December in the middle of a storm. And various of the relatives brought in camper vans which had cookers and so on so they could make hot drinks. But it was all very much a sort of muddling through rather than anything that was planned. Part of the health policy in Britain is that people should be decanted from large hospitals into what is called care in the community. In other words, you go and live back in your house, you stay independent rather than being hospitalised. But all these forms of care require electricity. People with chairlifts, people with emergency alarm buttons around their necks, people with dialysis machines, oxygen concentrators, all this lot work on electricity. And when we lost electricity, we lost everything connected with care in the home. Schools were also badly affected. This is a local primary school. The head teacher came to our meeting, and she said she couldn't communicate with staff. She couldn't contact parents. One school took a big bed sheet and wrote on it, "School closed until Wednesday," and pinned it to the notice board or to the fence outside the school. This is supposed to be a country that's using internet, that's going electronic, that's all that sort of modern stuff. And yet the only way she could actually communicate with parents was to pin a big label to the fence. They have an access control system and an alarm system, but the alarm system, because it's being subcontracted out, actually doesn't anymore go to the school caretaker, but it goes to an office that happened to be in Belfast. And the idea is that the person in Belfast then receives the alarm messages and phones through to the head teacher. And that, of course, didn't work, so there were alarms going off everywhere and no one quite knew. No road lighting, no sort of slow down signs for children. The whole thing had to be closed down. Luckily, Storm Desmond had this effect over the weekend, and so they'd had time to plan by Monday. If it had happened at 10 o'clock on Monday morning, after parents had delivered their children to the school and then gone home, nobody quite knows what would have happened. Another area that had quite serious effects was shopping. One supermarket did have an emergency generator. and they continued to work. Their electronic tills were working. The staff didn't have to go back with pencil and paper to do the adding up. But they weren't connected back to the head office, and so the electronic tills didn't automatically restock the supermarket. How many people, when they go out shopping, take cash nowadays? Who's got lots of cash? I'm not going to rob you on the way home, but just indicate, how many of you, when you go shopping, you think you're going to buy by cash? And how many think they're going to buy by swipe card or credit card? Okay, so when electricity stops and you no longer have credit cards working, what do? We ended up in a situation where restaurants were actually saying, well, we've got this food, we can't keep it because the freezer's gone, we will just cook meals and serve it for free because we can't get money from anybody because nobody can pay us. But is this really the way you plan for the future without electricity? There was another very specific problem in Lancaster, which was that there is a law in Britain called the Sunday Trading Law, which basically says that big shops have to close at 4 o'clock. And at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there were queues out in the street for people knowing it was the only shop in town that was selling food. And the person in the shop manager said, well, we've got to close, sorry. Nobody seemed to have the authority to say, don't be ridiculous, keep this thing open until people have been fed. And this is really a question of where the delegation comes and where the organisation comes. So, as I mentioned, no access to money. The credit cards don't work. You can't get cash. The automatic telling machines don't work. And you don't get any fuel for your cars. Petrol stations use electricity, electric pumps. I took this picture a few days ago, actually. It was one of the garages I went to during the crisis and actually bought some batteries from them, which was about the last thing they had. They couldn't sell petrol. Interestingly, this was a fire engine refilling from a commercial petrol station or a commercial fuel station. And you have to ask yourself the question, well, if that fuel station were not working because of lack of electricity, would the entire emergency services fleet stop running as well? I did do a talk similar to this somewhere in northeast of England, and afterwards a police chief came up and said to me, you know, we refuel all our police cars from the local petrol station. You've made me think. And this was an issue where nobody had thought through how you actually refuel emergency vehicles in this sort of a crisis. This is our local lifeboat station. Lancaster's on the coast, and it has this really nice rolling shutter door, electrically operated door. There's a similar door on the ambulance station, and it turned out, I didn't witness this, but I've been told, that in fact they had to break down the door in order to get the ambulances out, because the way in was through an electronic lock. Once you're inside, it's an electronics to lift the thing up. So overall, how do you plan that? It's not very obvious. Our bus operator had in the back of his cupboards some hand-operated pumps left over from decades ago. And so the bus drivers were given the instruction, before you take out your bus, you park it there and you use this diesel pump for about 10 minutes to fill the bus, and then you can drive away. And when they wanted light in their offices, they arranged for a bus to go and park with the headlights shining in through the windows, and that was they continued working. But it was all a bit sort of ad hoc, you might say, and a bit random, and it did work, but how long it would have continued working for, I'm not sure. The railway station shut down. Now, in fact, the 25,000-volt line, which is much the same as one has in Norway, was working because it was fed from outside the area to the north and to the south. The signalling system continued to work because there are 25,000 to 800 AC volts transformers in each signalling area as a backup. But there's a whole lot of kit on the stations, including ticket machines, lights, and so on, and none of that was working. And there's a regulation that says, after dark, you're not allowed to board trains unless the lights are on. And I went to sort of look for this is after the event, I went to look for the station manager to say, well, why? You know, sort of, haven't you got candles or floodlights or torches or something? I couldn't find a station manager because of the way it's now organised. The station manager is actually 60 kilometres away somewhere else. And of course, he'd had no means of communicating with the station anyhow. So quickly you found that this regulation that was doubtless there for very good reasons, that you've got to have a lighted platform before you can actually board passengers, had been quite a serious problem. At roughly the same time, the university, which has about 12,000 students, was saying, we're going to close a week early for Christmas. Everyone please go home. So we were trying to persuade about 10,000 students to get on the train just at the same time as the train service was being cancelled because there were no lights on the station. So things were not as well coordinated as they might have been. So in summary, here are some of the potential effects of a cyber attack on the grid. The obvious one, no lights. Well, everybody expects that. In most houses, no central heating, no TV or digital radio, no way of communicating with people. Only traditional phones working, so no mobiles, no wireless handsets, no internet, no social media. Interestingly, the power equipment company, the power supply company, was informing their customers what was going on and what progress they were making using Twitter. And when you sort of work out, well, how's that Twitter going to get to any of the people affected? It was a bit unobvious. Powered garage doors were not working. Powered access, powered gates, powered doors, all that sort of thing. No street lights, shops being closed. Credit cards not accepted, no cash machines, schools not working, couldn't get in touch, no petrol or diesel, and probably worst, there was no official information. Now we had this situation where they'd set up, I'm told, a gold command, a silver command, all the rest of it, a big structure of emergency planning. But for those of us on the ground, and for the head teachers in schools, and for the vice-chancellor at the university, there was no information coming from anywhere else, and everybody thought, I'm on my own. And that was a problem. So all this lot has been written up in this report, which you can get on the web, and which has become something of a must-read for our local distribution operators because of their realizing that loss of electricity is no longer just a loss of electricity. Loss of electricity is basically fundamental to losing everything that we value about civilization today. Thank you.